You have such a long title, Jeff.
I know. Maybe I'd like to get rid of the intermunicipal part. It's a little hard to say, but I guess it's important. Are we ready to go?
I'm ready.
Kim, are we good? All right. Kevin, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think everybody knows this, but I'll for the wider worldwide audience that's watching on Facebook or on the recording, I'll give a brief overview of who we are. So first off, I'm Kevin Geiger. I'm the senior planner at the Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission, TRORC, down in the corner there. And we are the Regional Planning Commission for East Central Vermont. We cover most of the northern part of Windsor County, most of Orange County, and 2 towns in Addison and 1 town in Rutland County. And we are akin to county government a little bit in other parts of the country. And we do a variety of things, mainly to assist towns. We're like the back office of towns in some ways. So we help them with their planning and zoning, which we're going to talk about tonight. But we also do work on energy. We do emergency management. We do water quality, brownfields, a whole variety of things, housing, policy, you name it out there. So if you're interested in what we do, you can look us up at trorc.org. And I've been in the business for a long time, and I'm the senior person on land use regulations. So that's kind of be my focus tonight. And Jeff.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Martin. I'm the Intermunicipal Regional Energy Coordinator with Two Rivers, or the IREC for short. So I work specifically with 6 towns in our region, Barnard, Fairleigh, Sharon, Strafford, Thetford, and Woodstock. And the goals of the program are basically to lower energy use, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and use more renewable energy in those participating towns. And so it's the first of its kind position in the state. It took advantage of a change in statute that allowed RPCs to promote cooperative arrangements and implement and administer service agreements among towns. So it's been a lot of fun this first year figuring out how to design this program and implement projects. And thankfully next year I'll be continuing on working with at least 4 of the current towns. Unfortunately, Fairleigh will not be continuing. Still waiting. Barnard hasn't had their town meeting yet, so we're not sure yet in Barnard, but hopeful. And we'll also be adding 2 new towns, so Bradford and Norwich, which is super exciting. So thank you all for being here, and really excited for the conversation tonight.
Great. And Jeff's going to be running the slides.
Did that work?
That worked.
All right.
And people are free to ask questions. Literally raise your hand and we can see you. You can use the little hand raising thingy, technically known as the hand raising thingy. And you can also use the chat, which I'm assuming somebody is going to watch. Sarah has raised her hand there. That was a good example of raising the hand. Do you have a question, Sarah? Oh, you are on mute. Okay, I'm going to take that as not a question. So this is just what we're going to cover. This is a preview of what we're going to cover ahead, which is the relation of town plans and bylaws to energy in particular, future land use area and districts, and how that can relate to energy. So we're going to go from the big geography to down to the very site level. Review standards around subdivisions. There are a couple things around subdivisions that are energy related. Waivers and site plan, and then general standards. And then some stuff that does relate directly to perhaps your bylaw, but also the interplay of the plan and regulating energy projects, because there's some weird stuff over there. So that we save that for the end, because that's kind of spicy. So stay tuned.
Okay. So why are we doing this? Why does it matter? I think everyone here has a good sense of why this is important, but it's always good to remind ourselves. So the first image you see on the left there is the goals from the Vermont's 2016 Comprehensive Energy Plan, which are now requirements under the Global Warming Solutions Act. So you probably heard of the 90 by 2050 goal, which again is now a requirement. Also need to reduce total energy consumption by 1/3 by 2050. And then there are some specific goals within end use sectors as well. But of course, these goals and requirements exist for a reason, and the primary reason being climate change. And so I thought this image is actually pulled out of our regional plan, but came from the Union of Concerned Scientists, is pretty interesting and terrifying. It shows two different scenarios of what our climate, Vermont's climate, would look like in the future. So one under a lower emissions scenario, you see by the end of the century, Vermont's climate resembles present day Ohio and West Virginia, which is pretty dramatic, even in a lower emission scenario with some pretty substantial impacts as a result. But the higher emissions scenario is truly mind-blowing. If you can imagine Vermont's climate looking like present day Tennessee or Alabama and Georgia, that's pretty wild. So that is definitely a scenario we want to avoid. And so there are things that we can do to play our role in helping to avoid that worst case scenario.
Great, thanks. And so this on town plans and bylaws, this is just in case people aren't familiar with the process or haven't been through that process. They are drafted by the Planning Commission in Vermont. Both of them start there, and they're both adopted by the select board, unless the towns have voted to vote on those things, which some towns have. But in general, Planning Commission does it, and then the select board adopts it. And the plans lay the foundations for the bylaws. So you can't really do much in the bylaws unless you've said that you should do it over in the town plan. And that can be, it can be a wish in the town plan. It's like, we should consider doing this. We should consider using the stretch code. That gives you enough foundation to later actually use the stretch code, which we'll talk about later. But if you don't say anything about it, it's difficult to then have the foundation to go do it in the bylaw. And the plan itself can be what I call quasi-regulatory in the 248 proceeding. Tonight, we're going to use 248 proceeding, certificate of public good, maybe, Public Utility Commission, all in one term. And I see a chat from Linda, so I'm going to answer that. Great. But the 248 proceeding is the certificate of public good process for energy related stuff. And so bylaws. So bylaws are ordinances. They're typically the zoning. And so zoning and subdivision in Vermont are bylaws. Some people call them regulations or ordinances. That's fine. No danger in that. But they are all in the statute. They're all enabled as bylaws, is what they're talked about. Energy groups are great to have do some of the lifting there. So the Planning Commission's over there doing a bunch of work, and they're like, well, we have an energy section of the town plan, or we want to kind of roll energy into the zoning. Great to hand off to the Energy Committee and say, can you guys give us some input on this? And then especially where we see it is in the transportation section of the plan, the energy section, obviously, and then land use section, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, let me see. Oh, plans are renewed every 8 years. They actually run 8 years now in Vermont. Town plans called municipal plans, some parts of the country called comprehensive plans. And bylaws have no expiration. So once your bylaws in there, they keep going. But once you update your plan, and if you change your plan significantly, the next time you're over in the bylaw, you have to make it comport with the town plan, because bylaws shall always further the purposes of the town plan. Wonderful. And so these are two maps that don't exactly look the same, although it's like one of those kids games where you go, well, how are they different? And this is very confusing to towns sometimes, because when you're doing a plan, you do one of the things that's required is to do a future land use area map, which is the one on the left. And this, in fact, is for the town of Newbury, up in the tippy top of our region. So that on the left, and those are future land use areas. That's what we call them. They are not zoning districts because you haven't made zoning yet. And so we try not to call them districts. On the right, but it forms the foundation 4 zoning districts that you're going to make. So it's not surprising that the map on the right looks a lot like the map on the left. But if you were to look in kind of, oh, I can't, my cursor won't show. You can't see. Oh yeah, go down a little, Jeff, right in there. You'll see, or a little to the right. You see that gray extension along the side of the road there? Just above that. There you go, right in there. That gray extension on the left is white, and on the right it's gray. See, that's the big difference between the two maps right there. So you can make little changes. That map is not, you don't have to photocopy it over when you do the bylaw, but you have to further the purposes of the plan again. So you have to, pass the squint test, as I call it. The reason we're talking about these maps, though, is these maps are a way to just kind of concentrate energy use. You can think about them as concentrating land use, but by doing so, they concentrate energy use, right? And so you see those little dark colors way up in the top, that red and that orange. That's the Village of Wells River. And then down lower in the kind of mustardy color and purple right along the eastern seaboard of the town, that's Newbury Village, a little down lower there, Jeff. Right to the right of that. Yeah, right on the edge of town. So those are the 2 villages. That's where most of the stuff's going to happen in the bylaw. And so that has the highest density. It's the easiest place to build. And then you see white and gray along the roads. The white you can build some, the gray you can build less. And then a lot of the town is in that green. And it tends to be bigger parcels, but you can build less there. And so one of the effects of that is that the closer you are to town, which is also the less you have to drive, the more you can build. So if you think about commuting patterns and stuff like that, you're trying to reduce commuting patterns, making it walkable, all of those things that we try to do. So you can do that in a village. So when you do your plans and your subsequent bylaws, you allow that by creating that density. You don't have to be, 5 acres apart. You can be really tight. And in fact, if you have sewer and water, you can be as tight as you want to go. So that's why we bring this up. So that's on the big scale. Next slide.
There we go.
Subdivisions. And this is a little, I don't know of many of our towns that use this at all, but you certainly can use this part that I'm going to be talking about in subdivisions. We do have several towns that have subdivision bylaws that are either inside their zoning, we call that a unified bylaw, or that it's an actual separate bylaw. But subdivision bylaws regulate how you subdivide. And so in this case, think of this colored square as one big lot, and they're trying to come in and do a 4-lot subdivision out there. And one of the things you can do in these type of things is you often can regulate cut lines. And so one of your subdivision standards may be, we don't really want you out in the middle of the forest, and we don't want you really out in the middle of the field. You have to write it a little more technical than that, but that's the gist of what you can say. And so in doing that, you could say, well, we are going to establish a cut line during our review, which actually says where you can cut the trees. But you can also do this thing we call building envelopes, which is this is where the buildings are going to go. And you don't do like the outline of the house. That isn't that. You do, several times the size of the house because you don't know exactly how it's going to work out. But you say, this is where the building is going. And you're doing that for several reasons. That's a lot of the disturbance. So you may be saying, well, we're trying to preserve forest. We're trying to preserve wetlands. Chris has noted in the chat that unified development bylaws are a good complement to going to the DRB model. If you have development review, it's nice because then you got all your review in one body. So you might as well put all your regulations in one regulation too. And it saves a lot of flipping in the old binder and meeting notices and that type of thing. So in this particular case, where they have done the building envelopes, they're probably doing several other things as well. They're keeping you out of interior forest. They're keeping some farmland, but they're also giving people solar access, and they're making you somewhat have solar access because you're going to be down on the edge of the forest, down in the south. And and Jeff has asked about roofs, and we're going to talk about roofs later. Jeff, you've seen the trailer for this movie, I can tell. So no spoilers. But yes, so this is because once we get to this point and we make lots, it can become difficult under zoning, although not impossible, but just unusual, to then put that house on the lot. And so in this case, we're actually putting the house somewhat on the lot. And these, because these lots might be, go back into the dark green when we get all done. Review standards. So we are going to go, this is not the full slide. We're going to go over each of these one by one by one. We're going to talk about site plan review standards. So site plan review is done. It's a site plan approval process prior to a zoning permit. And that's done by your development review board or your zoning board of adjustment, and not done for houses. It's specifically not enabled for single family homes under Vermont law. So you can't do site plan for houses. Waivers. Waivers are a process by which you can change your rules, but you have to write it down. And so you have to create a box. You have to say under these conditions, this body, either the zoning administrator or something like the DRB, can change the rules, and this is how they can change the rules. So it has to be, it's not just a wide open barn door. It's a very specific process out there. So we'll talk about that. General standards. General standards are a standard that is non-discretionary and typically just done by the zoning administrator. They just say, did you meet that standard? Yes, no, check out there. And anything that's inside the building, and we're going to talk about the inside the building part tonight, and outside the building too, and the building itself. And then we'll talk about certificates of occupancy, which is yet another thing that the zoning administrator would issue at the end to make sure you built what you said you were going to build. And it's not the permit, it's like the thing that says that you did what the permit says, and it allows you to occupy the building, hence the certificate of occupancy. Okay. So any questions so far? Looking good. All right. I'm sure we'll generate some more questions as we go forward. So site plan. Site plan review, again, is done for typically commercial projects. You don't have to require it for all commercial projects. Also done for multifamily. And it is a process where you're not debating whether the use is appropriate in the district or not. That's a conditional use approval. You're doing things that show up on site plans. So think of those blueprint type looking things that show the roads and the buildings and the bushes and everything. This is where you look at those things and go, wait a minute, you need to do this, 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 this. In Vermont, we have no mandatory standards for site plans. The law enables you to do several things, but you don't have to do them all. But it specifically calls out things like landscaping and screening and traffic and parking. And so most towns regulate those under site plans. It also has a provision under site plan that says, and anything else you want to regulate under site plan. So you have a wide open ability to use this as you need to. And so some of the things that we thought could be done energy related is you look at EV charging stations, or at least the preparation of EV charging stations. So in site plan, they're showing you the parking, and you can say, where are the EV charging stations going to be? Now, you can't say that just because you thought of it that minute. All of these things have to be based in your standards. So you have to have a standard that says, demonstrate, where EV charging stations will be or something. Now, a lot of people might say, well, I don't want to build an EV charging station because nobody's got an electric car. And in fact, I believe Dartmouth in their new parking garage just built 4 electric charging stations, which is kind of a travesty. But we're going to have a bunch of electric cars, and sooner the better. And the goal is for there to be hundreds of electric cars almost per town in 10 years, and then thousands 10 years after that. And so that's going to involve a lot of electric charging, and we don't want businesses to be like, well, wait a minute, now we need to come get a permit for electric charging, or I can't do electric charging because now I have to rip up my sidewalk and put in that conduit. So in your permit process, in doing that preparatory stuff, you might say, oh, you have to build it so electric charging can be there, but you don't actually have to put in the meter because maybe we're going to make different meters in the future. But you got to build the conduit, can be an empty conduit, but all that stuff that's going to make it easier later, we might require you to do now. Jeff, you had I'm going to see Jeff had a comment here there. Yes, okay, Jeff, we're going to talk about the RBs, the Residential Building Energy Standards. Jeff says he believes that they are now required in multifamily homes.
I think just the electricity to provide it. I don't think the charger is required yet.
Oh, okay, yep. And so again, the next thing is the same way, transit stops, sidewalk ped connections. So a transit stop, you might say, well, we're on a main route and you're going to need a transit stop at some point. You don't have to build it now, but it's awfully hard to change the curbing and rip out that nice tree and do all the things that you're going to do for that transit stop later on. And you have no ability to come back to a permit. A permit's the one time you're going to be talking to them. And you can say, you have to accommodate a transit stop. Maybe that's just constructing it. Maybe it's used as a handicap parking space in the meantime, but we're going to make you build this thing and get ready at least for a transit. Again, you would use that judiciously and make sense. You're not going to use it out on a class 3 road. Sidewalk and bike connections, more in village areas or urban areas where you have a use and a use and a use, and they're all coming in for a permit. And you may say, well, you are going to need to connect to that use. So if somebody wants to go to your store, they don't have to get in a car and drive around. They can actually walk from your store to your store without jumping over the bush and going down through the swale and, kind of doing their own Olympics as they get over there. But maybe there's no store next door, but we're going to require at least the right of way. And we're going to tell you right now in the permit that when that store gets built, you're going to have to connect to them and build the sidewalk. And of course, when they get built, we're going to tell them they have to connect back across. And that's the way you can deal with both the interconnections, which is good, saving energy, and your one bite at the apple, permit time, without making people build a sidewalk that goes to nowhere right now, because you don't know exactly how the neighbor is going to build their lot. Landscaping, a little more esoteric, but you can save some energy out there through the landscaping. You can build shade trees. Heat is going to be an issue in future years, and the less we have to heat, obviously, or cool, the less energy we're going to use. So you might think about shade trees on the south side and windbreaks on the west side. Years ago, when I was doing more energy stuff, windbreaks on the west side were a big thing to just cut down wind across structures. But there are ways. Oh, and here, and so here's this. Think of this as the site plan. Again, we're looking down on the earth. So we might say, okay, you got to put a transit stop over there. Maybe it isn't even signed or anything. It's just part of the road, but we have to be able to turn it into a transit stop later and not muck with all the traffic and circulation. There's some parking. We're going to say, okay, you can do some parking out here. Shade trees. That's not a bad shade tree. I just picked this. This is actually like 2 different uses, but I picked this as reasonably representing a site plan. And so you can see that tree is shading the structure to the north. And interconnection to the uses, you can see there's a little white sidewalk that goes from the parking lot in the back to the parking lot in front. And so again, if we were to happen to park on one business, we could walk to the other business and back and forth. And that's what we want to have happen. But site plan's all about the site, the things on the site. Waivers are where I see kind of you able to use incentives. Waivers are one of the things where you can change dimensional requirements and dimensional requirements only. You can't change a use. You can't do things other than change dimensions. But you might say, if you do X energy-wise, we'll give you more Y dimensional change. And so in this example, waivers may be granted by the DRB, the Development Review Board. You have to say who's going to do it. To increase heights or decrease setbacks, what are they allowed to do? By no more than 50%. So you've set the box on them so they can't go crazy and make it 0 or 1,000,000 feet high. But they can, maybe give an extra floor. Maybe they can cut their side setback in half. To achieve energy conservation or generation using the conditional use approval process. And so you have to also, if you're giving them a process like the DRB, you have to tell them what process you're going to do. So here the DRB would use the conditional use process, which has a standard about warnings and hearings and that type of thing. But this way maybe they'll get some extra height if they're doing some energy achieving stuff. Maybe that'll help them. And maybe if they're doing some conservation, you'll give them a little more room in the side setback or whatever. So here you're basically one way to give bonuses for people doing the things that you want them to do on energy. Waivers are used for other stuff too, but that's that we're just talking energy tonight. Okay, Jeff, is this you or me?
This is still you, Kevin.
Still
Last
me.
one.
Okay, last one. Yeah, very good. General standards are things that you write typically in a bylaw under a heading that says general standards. Yeah, so you're not very tricky there. And they are not discretionary. And they can apply even to exemptions. So you may have things that are exempt from regulation under your bylaw, but oftentimes in that exemption clause, it says such and such things are exempt, provided they comply with setbacks and general standards. So you don't need to approve the shed or the parking lot or the whatever, but we may have already said some rules around them, which are just the rules. We don't need to rethink them, and off they go over there. And the ZA can, if they're in just a straight zoning permit, the ZA can say, yep, they met the standard. And if they're outside, then they just self-certify essentially. And they typically regulate physical things and impacts of physical things. So things like noise and lighting, which I understand are physical things, but they may regulate that, and we will talk about those things out there. And they can apply to all uses. So you may have a general standard that's like everybody in town, this is the deal, everybody in town is going to use LED lighting, period. Or they may say, oh, only certain uses, only commercial lighting we're going to regulate. We're not going to regulate what you put in your house. Or they may apply in a certain district. And you may say, only in this district does this standard apply. But wherever it is, it's not a choice, it's not a decision, it's not a discussion. That's just the standard, and you write it so anybody reading it knows what to do. Okay.
All right.
Now you're gone.
Now me. So, and just so everyone knows, I can't see the chat, or at least I don't know how to see the chat since I'm presenting. So if you have a question, Kim, if you could relay those questions to me, that'd be great.
It was just popping up on my screen, which I've never seen before. So
yeah, I think because I'm presenting, I can't see it.
Oh, okay.
I can watch it.
And I also can't see everyone's face, so I can't see them raise their hands. All right, so some examples of general standards that are energy related. The first, I won't go into detail now, but I have a full slide on this next, and Jeff mentioned this a little bit earlier, the energy standards. So there are residential building energy standards, or RBES, as well as commercial building energy standards, or CBES. And then there's also a stretch code, which applies to the RBs. Unfortunately, doesn't apply in the CBs anymore. But that stretch code goes, so the RBs and CBs are the minimum standards for energy, and the stretch code goes beyond those minimum standards. So I'll talk more about that on the next slide. You could also require net zero new construction. So towns have the option to go above code, above the RBs or CBs. And so you could require net zero construction. By that, I mean that a building produces enough renewable energy over the course of a year to meet its energy demand throughout the year. So you don't have to instantaneously meet your demand with renewable energy, but over the course of the year, it nets zero. You're using only energy, or sorry, yeah, you meet all of your energy demands from on-site renewables. So if you were to require net zero new construction, you'd have to define what that means beyond what I just said. You'd have to come up with some way to verify that it is net zero. So that could be, for example, you could use a national standard or an international standard. You could require a certain home energy rating score, home energy rating system score, a HERS rating. You could require passive house certification. And another option would be Efficiency Vermont has a new construction program, which has a net zero option. And that's a nice option because you get to work with an Efficiency Vermont consultant, and you actually get an incentive for going through that program. So if you were to require a different program, you'd have to pay to have that consultant certify the home or the commercial building. Whereas with the Efficiency Vermont program, there's an incentive to do so. Probably don't want to require net zero new construction for residential, at least not at this point. But I could see that happening with commercial buildings. It's just a higher level of construction where you've got architects and engineers involved, and it'd be less burdensome for commercial construction. Jeff, I see you're off mute, so if you've got a question, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that, I lost it, never mind. There was something that wasn't, okay, Efficiency Vermont has a program that is net zero ready. It's essentially the efficiency component that you need to achieve, but it does not require the renewables. They also have a service that is just slightly above code. So you don't have to go all the way to, to their near net zero component. And you get paid for doing either of them.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And I think, Jeff, for commercial, they actually have a full net zero program. For residential, it's net zero already. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide too. The third bullet here, roof orientation or solar ready. So roof orientation, you could require that a building be oriented to get southern exposure so that it could have a solar array, even if there's no solar array installed at the time of construction. In the future, it would be a roof that's good for solar. So that's one option. You could go further and require that the building be solar ready. And so it would have to meet more requirements to be solar ready. So again, you don't have to install the solar system at the time of construction, but you have to make sure that the building could handle a solar system in the future. So that would be things like making sure that there's enough space on the roof, where there are no obstructions like chimneys or vents going through the roof that would prohibit the installation of a solar array, making sure that it meets the load requirements for the addition of an array. So you're not having to reinforce the roof in the future. Making sure that there's an interconnection pathway so that there's a way to run conduit from the roof to the electrical panel, and then also reserving space on the electrical panel for the future array. So these are all things that you can require without requiring the array itself, that keep the cost of going solar in the future, keep that cost down. And actually, this solar ready piece is part of stretch code. So you could adopt stretch code and that would be included, or you could pull the language from stretch code and just adopt a solar ready standard. EV charging requirements, Kevin mentioned this before in terms of the site plan, but this could be a general standard as well. You could actually require the charging station, or you could at least just say that it has to be EV charging ready. So there has to be conduit run to the parking space. And again, this is something that is in the stretch code. So you could adopt stretch code, or you could look to the stretch code for language around EV charging, though the requirements are not that strict in the stretch code, so you might want to go further. And then finally, no new fossil fuel. So this would be a big one, but this is something that I think we ultimately have to do if we're serious about addressing climate change. So this would prevent the installation of heating systems, water heaters, stoves, any fossil fuel in a building. And anytime, so for example, you put in a new heating system, that system's going to last for at least 30 years, maybe 40, even 50 years. So that's locking in fossil fuel use for decades. And that really isn't compatible with the science around climate change and what we have to do to address it. So this would definitely be a controversial one, and you get plenty of pushback, but I think ultimately we need to start doing this. Oh, and Kevin mentioned on this one, you could restrict the use of fossil fuel in new construction, but you could also, it's Title 24, Section 4412 allows fixing non-compliant things over time. So you can't tell someone that's living in their home right now that has a fossil oil boiler that they've got to throw it out and put in a heat pump. But you can say when it comes time to replace that system, or when that system dies, you can't put in a new fossil fuel system. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, exactly. A non, because they would be non-conforming by having the oil system there, and you'd say when you're going to make a change, you have to become conforming.
So I'll move on to the next slide unless there are questions.
Jeff, there was a note from Jeff that says stretch code is also required where residential construction is under Act 250 jurisdiction.
Yep, that's correct. And oh, right. Then and there used to be stretch code for commercial energy standards, but that is no longer the case. All right, so I'll dive a little bit deeper into RBES and CBES and a little bit about stretch code. So the residential building energy standards, commercial building energy standards, these are minimum standards for all energy components of the building. So it regulates the building envelope and the heating system efficiency, windows. And it's required for all new construction and additions, alterations, renovations, or repairs to existing residential and commercial buildings. So this is actually state law. And so it doesn't matter if your town requires a CO or not. It doesn't matter if you have zoning or not. This applies to all new construction and so on throughout the state of Vermont. And so that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize, don't even know about sometimes. And so that's a good thing to talk with your town officials about and just remind them that this exists and it is a requirement. And so even when someone comes in for a permit, it's required that the administrative officer provides the applicant with a copy of these standards. And so again, that's probably something that's not happening a lot of times, and town should be aware of that requirement. In addition, a builder, when they complete a project, they have to file a certificate, in either an RBES or a CBES certificate that certifies that they've met these standards. And they have to file it with the town as well as the state Department of Public Service. And they have to permanently affix a certificate to the building. Again, not something that happens a lot. So definitely something to remind town officials that they should be receiving these certifications anytime a new building is built, or addition or alteration, renovation or repair. They should be getting these certificates. And even if they don't have zoning, they should be receiving these certificates. There are several exemptions. For example, mobile homes are exempt, buildings that are not conditioned, not heated or cooled. And then kind of the big one are owner builder projects. So if you are the one, or if you're the person that owns the home and you build the home, you're exempt from meeting the energy code. But you do have to meet several criteria to qualify as an owner builder. And you have to certify that you've met those criteria by filing a disclosure, again, with the town clerk and the Vermont Department of Public Service. So the criteria include the owner has to be in charge of construction. So they have to be the general contractor. They have to live in the building. They have to, they have to evaluate whether they met code or not. Sorry, there we go. And so they have to evaluate whether or not they met code. And if they didn't, they have to disclose how they didn't meet code. If they did, they have to file their RB certificate. And then finally, the big thing is that before they sell the property, if they go to sell the property, they have to disclose in writing to the prospective buyer that this is an owner builder project, and they have to disclose where they didn't meet code if they didn't meet code. So, you know, there are ways that a town could try to discourage even owner builder projects from not complying with RBES. You could include a notice in the land record that it's an owner builder project and that they have to tell prospective buyers when they go to sell the home, just as kind of a reminder that that's the case. And that would probably discourage people from not complying with code. But that is one little loophole, not loophole, but one challenge. So not having an RBES, not filing an RBES or a CB certificate does not cloud the title. So that's unfortunate. That would be a pretty big stick for not complying with the RBES or the CBs. However, you know, just because it doesn't cloud the title, Kevin mentioned that, you know, it doesn't mean that it doesn't create a zoning violation, and so that would come with fees potentially, and it also could make it more difficult to sell the home in the future if that's filed in the land records with the property. And then finally, as we've talked a little bit about already, so towns can adopt a more restrictive local standard than the RBES or the CBs. So that could be going as far as net zero, or it could just be adopting stretch code, which I mentioned is available within the code for residential construction. So just one thing to note about that, this is something that we're looking at with some of the towns that I'm working with. First, we were just wanting to adopt stretch code, because that code is stronger than the base code than RBES. But as I've kind of mentioned a little bit on this slide, it's not really clear that RBES, that base code, is even being met in a lot of cases. And so it's also not clear whether just adopting stretch code would improve the efficiency of new construction. If the base code's not even being met, just adopting stretch code might not even help. So one thing that we're looking at that I just wanted to mention, we're not sure if it's legal yet, but we're trying to get an answer to that, is just trying to encourage compliance with the RBES, with the base code. And basically, without going into too much detail, there are 3 ways that you can comply with RBES. The first 2 rely on self-certification. So the builder just signs off on that RBES certificate that they've met the code based on some standards. The third compliance pathway relies on a third party to certify that you've met the standards. And so we're hoping that we can restrict the compliance pathways and require that you go through that third compliance pathway of having a third party certify that you've met code. And that would definitely encourage compliance with the RBES. It would also give builders almost a consultant or a coach to help them learn the code better and make sure that they're meeting it. Because that's one of the major issues, is that builders just don't have the training in a lot of cases to meet the standards, and they don't have the incentive to go through the trainings because there's not a lot of enforcement. So having a third party help them through that process could be a big benefit and encourage compliance. And then the last thing I wanted to note is just that there is a proposal right now that's passed the House. It's now in the Senate for a contractor registry. Right now in Vermont, you don't have to be licensed to be a builder, and there's not even a registry, statewide registry that has all of the builders in the state. So this bill would require that residential contractors register with the state, provide a proof of insurance, and produce a written contract if the work exceeds $3,500. So it's still a pretty low bar, but it would definitely help, and it would help meet these energy standards as well.
So Jeff, I had two things. I saw in the chat that the other Jeff noted that on commercial buildings that labor and industry does the certification. They actually check things on the commercial buildings. So I think, is that right, Jeff?
That's my understanding. And so really there is a cloud on the title. They don't have the certificate of occupancy until they meet the labor and industry requirements. On the residential side, the legislation explicitly says that if it doesn't meet code, or even if it's falsely certified, that there's no defect in the marketable title. So when I teach code to realtors, at that point, I usually see pencils go flying in the air and this giant sound come out of their mouths. Like, why do I care?
Right. And so our advice is, just because it doesn't create a defect in title doesn't mean it doesn't create a zoning violation. And because you might have that in your zoning. And so they could still, if they have a zoning violation for that in the permit record, that zoning violation probably also does not create a cloud on title, but it says violation up top. And owners, when they see that thing, go, what's that? I don't like that, make that go away. And so that's kind of a roundabout way. And potentially it also still leaves you open to fines, which the legislature did not say that you necessarily got to avoid. So there may be a couple ways to still put the squeeze on folks around this. Jeff mentioned the contractor registry. One of the things that would do is, if you failed to be issuing the certificates like you did, like you're supposed to, the state could ban you from the registry. And then therefore you would no longer be a contractor and you wouldn't be able to operate in Vermont. And so that's kind of the reason they're looking at that registry part of life. If I'm correct, am I correct on that, Jeff? That's one of the reasons why.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Any other questions on this slide before I move on?
You said something about the legislature reviewing at this time the ability for a town to adopt a more restrictive local standard. Because I've had experience with Heinsberg requiring Energy Star, frankly. So that really required a third-party verification, and it set a standard that people had to reach, which I don't think we had the stretch code yet, so I don't know how that might have compared. But
no, sorry. The above code, towns are allowed to adopt above code programs. So what I was referring to is, I'm not sure if the towns are allowed to restrict the compliance methods with RBES. So I think it would effectively make it above code, because you're having to get a third party to certify that you've met code, which is much better than self-certification, but I don't know if that would meet that standard of above code.
Yeah, since the legislature enables 3 ways, we're not sure if you can pick just one of them, or if you have to go, well, they said we can do it 3 ways, so we can do it any of the 3 that we want. Okay.
All right.
Oh, good. And I see in the chat from Sarah Gallagher, In a town with no zoning and no building permits, who's responsible for getting the documentation? That's good. They still have to give the town the documentation. Do they give it to the town clerk, Jeff? Or
Yeah, it should go to the town clerk.
and it should still be filed in the land records.
All right, so the certificate of occupancy, I'm just going to touch on this really briefly, but if a town requires a certificate of occupancy, and Kevin, jump in if I mess any of this up, it's not lawful to occupy the land or the structure until the CO has been issued by the administrative officer. And so the administrative officer has to make sure that they complied with all of the bylaws, and then they would issue the certificate of occupancy, allowing someone to move in. And this helps, it makes it easier to enforce the filing of the RBES or CB certificate, because that would be a condition for getting the certificate of occupancy. You'd have to turn in your RBES or CB certificate. So this is another option for increasing compliance with the RBES.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, so regulating solar. So there's some weird stuff. This is the spicy part a little bit. This is what you're waiting for. You know, this is the chase scene of this presentation. And part of this is there's just legacy language out there, and that never got cleaned up. And so there's this thing and this thing and this thing in the statute. All of these are in Title 24, all of these sections that we're going to be referring to. But there are regulations, there are restrictions in the law about how you can regulate, or if you can regulate certain things. And one is regulating small scale solar systems. And so if somebody's going to put a solar installation, which can be an electric a PV system or just a hot water system, on a flat roof or flattish roof at less than 5%, then you can't regulate that. And that's in 4413 G1 and 2. Also, if they're going to do a thing out there, if they're going to put a solar collector on top of a roof that's going to be less than 10 feet sticking up above the top of a roof, you can't have the effect of prohibiting that, but you actually can like fiddle with it a little bit. You don't have the ability to regulate clotheslines, so you can't ban clotheslines under your zoning. There's some question as to whether you can still do it under private covenants, and we have some places in the region that do private covenants, but you could write in your zoning, you can't write a private covenant that bans clotheslines. It would probably be a good idea. And the third thing in there is that you can't have this little weird part that says you can't have the effect of prohibiting other renewable stuff. And it's kind of a little wide open thing in there. And I'm not quite sure anybody's tested exactly what they mean in that particular part. But it would be interesting to see what people mean in there and how far you could stretch that. The second bullet there is the blanket restriction. So your zoning bylaws, your subdivision bylaws or whatever, are specifically prohibited from regulating stuff that goes and gets a certificate of public good under the 248 process, which is basically anything that connects to the grid. If you're doing a little wind tower that doesn't connect to the grid, or you're doing solar trackers in your yard and they're not connecting to the grid, then they are regulatable by your local zoning. But anything that connects to the grid is a 248 process, and some other things that you wouldn't think of, a freestanding generation station. So that's all you're building. You don't have to build a house or a commercial building. All you're doing is generating solar or putting up a wind tower. You can't regulate those under your bylaws. And pipelines also fall into that category. They get certificates of public good. But then the legislature added yet another weird thing, which is this 4415 thing. And I actually have it open so I can read it there. And it has to do with solar, it specifically has to do with solar plant screening. And it says, yeah, forget it, notwithstanding, forget about all that other stuff that we told you can't regulate this. You can actually kind of regulate this if you adopt a freestanding bylaw. So this is, you do your own special bylaw out there that it has screening standards that apply to ground-mounted solar. So that's, you know, the box. It's only screening standard. It's only ground-mounted solar, and the municipality may make recommendations to the Public Utility Commission under the bylaw. And it says, and you may designate which body gets to do that. So this is a weird spot where you could say, oh, the select board is actually going to run this bylaw versus a development review board, or the planning commission, or the energy committee is going to run this bylaw. And it's a good hammer in that the screening requirements adopted under the subdivision shall be a condition of the certificate of public good. So this says, okay, Public Utility Commission, if we give you a standard, you have to use it, which is important. The other thing is, though, you can't make a standard that is just applying to solar screening that is unlike your standards that apply to screening for other things. So you can't say, well, we hate solar stuff, we don't want to see it, but we're happy to see big commercial industrial buildings. And they can't have the effect of prohibiting the installation of the thing. So you couldn't make the screening so high that the sun would never shine on the solar panels and that type of thing. After they do all that stuff, they say, oh, but still you never issue a permit. So it's a bylaw that you don't issue a permit. You end up issuing a recommendation, kind of like a permit. You just scratch out permit on top and you call it recommendation, I guess. It's a strange duck. And then that goes off to the Public Utility Commission. I don't know, I think Woodstock may have actually adopted such a thing, but I have no experience in towns actually using such a weird bylaw that isn't a bylaw, but is adopted. And I'm assuming, since they use the word bylaw, that you have to adopt it under bylaw provisions, so that you would still adopt it the same way, but you wouldn't use it the same way. It's a strange thing, suffice it to say. Oh, can towns regulate outdoor boilers? That, I would say, would fall. Jeff, you want to jump back there a sec?
Oh, yeah, if I can. There we go.
That's, I think that's one of the things that would fall under that 4413 thing, which says that, you know, energy devices based on renewable resources. You can't have the prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting that. And I think somebody could argue that an outdoor wood boiler is an energy device based upon a renewable resource. And so again, you probably could regulate them, but you can't regulate them to the point that you can't use them, like, oh, they have to be 1,000 feet from the next house or something. But I think there are probably grades of those things, where you might say that they have to be, you know, the new EPA particulate matter or something. So you can't just go like maybe make your own thing with a barrel out there. But it is a pretty wide open enabling or restriction on enabling that says that towns can't prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting energy devices based upon renewable resources. Okay.
All right, and finally, restricting uses other than solar. So things that would fall under zoning, you could say that no gas stations. That's no longer an acceptable use, or bulk fuel plants. And then things that would fall under the CPG process, the 248 process, fossil fuel pipelines, wind, hydro, and wood. So the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, would still have jurisdiction over these things. But if you could include something in your town plan saying that you don't want to see fossil fuel pipelines, for example, in your town, and if your town has an enhanced energy plan or determination of energy compliance, the Public Utility Commission would have to give substantial deference to the town plan when reviewing an application for like a fossil fuel pipeline going through your town. They'd have to really defer to the town plan, and there'd have to be a really good reason to permit something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is where that town plan becomes quasi-regulatory in a 248 CPG process. The town plan would essentially have standards in it that become bylaw-ish, and the Public Utility Commission has to look at them. They don't have to agree. They can find that the public good outweighs your stuff, but they have to have a very good reason. And that's the substantial deference clause. If you don't have a determination of energy compliance, which in our region is given by Two Rivers, then they only have to give you due consideration, and which is a little lighter, like, yeah, okay, we looked at your thing, but we're not going to pay attention to it that much. And so you might say things like, oh, that ridge we really don't want wind on because that's our special ridge, but other places, fine. Hydro, we don't want anybody to put a dam in there. Not that people are building hydro left and right, but we really value this stream. We don't want anybody to put a dam there. Things like that. And so those could have some effect. I wouldn't consider them a blanket, restrictions, but it doesn't hurt to say them for sure.
All right. That's it. So I'll stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
And evaluations, because Kim's gonna make you all evaluate us. Kim and the cat. Oh, the cat heard my name. It turned its head. He said, "Hi, Eli." So we are happy to take any questions now, or of course, you know where to find us.
Not so much a question. Go ahead. You were going to say something, Kimberly. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you guys go ahead. I was going to just start the evaluation if there weren't any questions, but yeah, please go for it.
I was just going to convey that as an energy coordinator for Rochester, I'm going to meet with our Planning and Zoning Commission or board and talk to them about a number of these options. I mean, just basically lay it out there as a menu so I don't choose the one that they can't swallow. But the reality is I'm going to be getting the names of anyone who's buying a property, an undeveloped property in Rochester, and getting them an energy code handbook to begin with. Mm-hmm. Just take it as a, here's what the state requires kind of thing. But I would like to see our town adopt the certificate of occupancy so that we can require that either owner-builder disclosure statement or the code certificate, and have some teeth in it, since the state isn't doing what it needs to do to enforce it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the CO is the best way right now that we have around that.
And I have a question. You have given me a lot of food for thought in terms of potential additions to our zoning regulations. So now I understand what bylaws mean. I'm used to hearing zoning and subdivision regulations. And so how big a deal, like from a planning commission perspective, if we had a collection of energy related revisions to suggest, but how easy is it for a planning commission to redo them? Is it a big hairy deal? So if we open, is it a can, like we'd be opening a can of worms that would involve all kinds of other stuff too? Or how does that work?
So the first off would be to look in your town plan. And if your town plan has a general foundational piece, like it may say, the town should, adopt regulations that improve energy efficiency, or just something to hang your hat on, that gives you enough room over there in your bylaw to go, oh, and we meant this, 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 and this. If it doesn't have language, and I'd be surprised if yours doesn't, frankly, Linda, then you would need to start at your town plan and put in a little foundational piece. So depending upon where your town plan is.
Yeah, I think we got that.
Yeah. And so then the planning commission would develop the language. Maybe you want to involve the energy committee. You you do a mailing, you do the notice, you hold a hearing. You have to have at least one hearing. Then it goes to the select board. They do the notice, and they could just adopt it. It's possible also that you could use the interim bylaw route, which is has some strings attached to how you can do it. But under that, the select board just holds a hearing and adopts. So it's a much faster process. But in your case, I would probably advise doing it the regular way. And they needn't take a lot of time. They have paperwork and mailings and stuff, but you could just say, here's the notice, and 6 weeks from now, we're going to have a hearing on this. We have the hearing. This is the change we want to do. What do y'all think? People show up and they go, great, hate it, great, hate it, great, hate it. You say, fine, we're moving ahead. Send it to the select board, and the select board, great, hate it, and maybe the select board just adopts. And it all depends on how much you want to get into that kind of back and forth, and fine tuning it, because there's always some way to make it slightly better out there.
But so a town can make changes in certain sections of zoning regulations without having to. They can just do it piecemeal. It's like they may be other things they're considering, but they don't have to take everything up at once.
No. You don't have to regulate the whole darn. You don't have to open up the whole can of worms. If your bylaw was not in compliance with your town plan, which we have a couple of those, like your future land use map and your town plan looks vastly different than your zoning map because you haven't touched your zoning in forever, then you would have to make other changes at the same time. But for you guys, I bet you it's fine. And so, right, you don't have to go, well, do we have to look at definitions again and everything else? No.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, on the spectrum that I've seen across the state, the Dorset Energy Committee, Jim Hand really was deeply involved in that. They actually inspect homes during construction for code compliance. That's how far one community in the state has taken it.
Right. And you can do that. You have to remember, zoning administrators are not empowered to enter onto property without permission, unlike health officers. However, they don't have to give you a permit either. So I want to come in and look. No, you can't. Well, not gonna get the CO ever.
I have a follow-up question, if there isn't a separate one from somebody else, with regard to certificate of occupancy. So we've discussed that a little bit and have some action item in our town plan relating to having our zoning administrator get some training about it. So what's your observation? Is it mostly a staffing issue? Like my understanding is that there are very few towns that actually have a requirement for that. And I've understood it to be principally because like who's going to be doing the inspection and issuing the certificate. Is that a good understanding of what the hump is, the barrier?
Well, there are two things, and Jeff's comment makes me think about this. The first is some people worry, well, how will the zoning administrator know you met compliance? And oh my goodness, we don't want to train them. And right now, met compliance is, did you hand me the certificate? Yes, no. So they don't have to become an expert. They're just going to be like, there's a piece of paper in my hand that you signed, good to go. I don't have to leave the office. I don't have to crawl inside your attic and look at the insulation, all that type of thing. But there is another step. And however, from the owner's point of view, it's a piece of paper to me that makes your house more valuable. Because when they come in and they say, does this thing mean anything? And the lawyers say, don't worry, it doesn't cloud title. Who knows what's in the walls? You go, well, wait a minute. No, I have a piece of paper that says it does. Even better is Dorset's thing where they're actually checking, because you can imagine the certificate that says we did the insulation right. We air sealed the windows. We did this and we did the other thing is very hard once the paint's on. And so if they're actually say, nope, when the wall is open, we want to come in and we're going to check. So that at the end, we know that you did everything. In that case, your administrator is going to need to know what things look like inside the walls. Or they could have a specialized contractor do that and say, you guys check when the wall's open and tell me that it's good or not. But at least I would say you do the bare minimum, which is, did you give me a piece of paper? Yes. Okay, good.
And that's
Yeah,
why.
that piece of paper is really important because, I mean, essentially, a builder is perjuring themselves if they didn't meet it and give it to you.
I have a thing to run by you. I had a conversation with a local builder who I think is, he's one of the ones trying to do things right. And his suggestion, and I wonder, is this a workable approach regulatory wise? His suggestion was to require a blower door test results. What do you guys think of that as something to put in a regulation?
It's already
is,
part
yeah.
of RBES.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it covers the base code or
I think
just the stretch code to start out.
I think it covers both.
Covers both? Well, then that does bring a third party in to do that testing. And that's a start, and then they can get that third party for free if they participate with Efficiency Vermont.
So there's a lot of food for thought here.
And that's why I'm really hoping this option is legal to restrict the compliance pathway, because then it brings in the third party. Actually, generally before you even begin construction, you'd have a HERS rater help with the design phase, and then they'd come out and they'd test the building before the drywall goes up, and then they'd do a final test out. And that would be, the town wouldn't have to be involved in that at all, but they would see that this third-party certifier had gone through those steps, and that's when they would issue the CO.
I mean, it's really critical to catch people at the permitting end of it. That we have a code, here's the code handbook, we have a statewide energy efficiency utility, here's their number. We have a certificate of occupancy. We're going to need this paperwork back to get that CO to you at the end of all of this. And just as Kevin said, it is documentation that they've got a better home, or at least a code compliant home.
Is it possible to require people? There aren't that many actual totally new homes built, but Jeff Martin, you said that the RBs have to be in compliance if you're doing a alteration and a renovation of your home. Does that mean doing anything, or does it mean doing some percentage of something that then it kicks in?
Jeff Gephardt, you'd probably know better than me. It's not really well defined as far as I can tell.
If you are changing something in the building that is likely to change the energy use, then the code comes into play. If you open up a wall, you've got to bring it up to code. You don't have to bring up to code 3 other walls that you didn't open up.
Oh.
It's the entity, the biggest gray area is in the ventilation area. If you're getting the tightness of the structure down to a certain level, then you really should be putting in ventilation. And the code doesn't do a very good job of defining how you would manage that. Really the primary effort is to get new construction to meet the code. And then secondarily, existing homes, but it's going to be hard to get, because we're not having the impact on the new construction that we should be having. There's just no way are the certificates being posted and filed with the town clerk and the Department of Public Service. And unless they pass something like that registry of builders, we're not really going to see much improvement. I mean, we got to know who the builders are to educate them.
Well, this is a topic that I can continue in more detail with Jeff Martin in July,
Yeah.
starting in July.
Yeah, you'll have a Jenny, I see you're off mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah, and so a question and a comment. So my question is because Jeff Martin, you and I were talking a little bit about this last week, and about sort of code not being enforced, being forced now. So it really doesn't make any sense to adopt stretch codes, or potentially it may not make sense to adopt stretch code when, the underlying code isn't being enforced anyway. But is there a reason not to encourage towns that if they are going ahead, if it's determined, which I think is kind of an if, I've read some of the materials, and so I am looking at kind of maybe some of the legal issues behind the concern about requiring or allowing towns to require third-party certification. But if they can do that and they go ahead and do that, would there be any reason not at that time to adopt stretch code? Because now you've got a town that seems willing to enforce it. It doesn't seem like that would be a statewide statement to not go ahead and adopt stretch code if you've got a town that's willing to enforce the underlying code.
Yeah, I mean, I guess personally, then this is just a personal opinion. So, but I would probably rather have that third-party certification, require that first, and because there's going to be a pretty significant learning curve getting builders working with a HERS rater and getting them trained to meet just the base code. So I would probably rather see that requirement come into play first, maybe for a couple of years, and then adopt stretch code. But that's just a personal opinion. So
okay, so the idea is kind of get your, well, not quite your training wheels, because this is the the main code, but sort of learn to walk before you can run kind of philosophy.
Yeah, that's how I would think of it.
Okay. And then the one comment I wanted to make is just that we've been, so I'm at Vermont Law School at the Institute for Energy and the Environment, and we've been looking at some ways to increase adoption for electric vehicles, and part of that has been through what towns can do for codes. And, as Jeff was saying, so the big hope was to do it through the building construction standards at the time, new construction is going into place, whether it's residential or commercial. But as Jeff's been kind of explaining, that's a pretty heavy lift at the moment. And there may also be there's some little legal quirks in the law that we have to make sure that we can get around. But I just want to make people know that there are some smaller things that towns can be doing that they should be looking at if they've got reviewing their zoning ordinances. Because at times, some towns may have some barriers to increasing electric vehicle charging in the towns. An example might be if it's associated with a conditional use permit for the underlying construction. So you've already got something there that's a conditional use permit. You want to make sure that it doesn't require a conditional use permit just if you're going to go put in an EV charger now in an area that has conditional use. One town that we're looking at has a limit of 2 accessory structures on any parcel. Well, if you've already got, maybe a standalone garage and you've got another shed, oops, well, now you can't have an EV charger because you would meet if your town defines an EV charger as an accessory structure.
Whoa.
That's
good. I haven't heard of anybody using that as an accessory structure, but your
in
first
Hartford,
point,
at least in Hartford, they had
wow.
decided that that an EV charger was an accessory structure, because an accessory structure has, or at least in some towns, has a very broad definition.
Yeah.
So there are just some small things like barriers that you might want to identify in your own zoning ordinance. And there are things that maybe you can do through town policies that encourage placement of EV chargers.
Yeah, that first one especially is a good one, which is what she's explaining is typically town zoning say anything that gets a conditional use. If you want to change there, you know, you want to put a deck on the back, you're going back through conditional use process. And towns can write provisions that say, you know, not changing it more than 10 feet, not adding more than 5% surface area, doing anything energy related does not require a conditional use. But you have to put the standard in, and then the ZA can just handle it. And that'd be a great idea, Jenny. Yeah, because other people don't want to open those up again.
Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about towns not having EV chargers as an accessory structure, given that I thought that was a fairly standard definition. And but the one nice thing about Hartford is it says, you know, accessory structures are permitted, and you know, it's just fairly a rubber stamp by the zoning administrator.
I think I'll start adding them to I have a standard exemption list up front, you know, which kind of says bird baths and tree houses. I think I'll just start putting EV chargers in there.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Jenny. I know we talked about that last week. I forgot to put that in the slides.
Great. Maybe Kim's got you then. So don't go anywhere.
So we have a really quick evaluation we just collect at the end of these trainings, and we'll do it through a Zoom poll. So I'm going to go ahead and click launch poll. So everything's anonymous, and you just go ahead and answer these. How many questions do we have? 6 questions for us. You're basically ranking coverage of the topic, effectiveness of the speaker, usefulness to you, time allocated for questions, and then letting us know your knowledge of the subject before and after this training. Okay, we've got 5 in, and that's everyone other than the Two Rivers people. So I'll turn that off. Thank you all for answering that.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Any last questions, or we can all go eat dessert or whatever.
You've got dessert.
That sounds good.
Are we going to get the slides from the presentation?
Jeff, will you send the?
Yeah, I can
so,
definitely send the slides.
So typically we PDF the PowerPoint, and that makes it a lot smaller file.
Yeah.
If that works. Okay.
Yeah.
That works.
Do we have everyone's email?
I think you got mine.
Yep. I think the only Sarah, I don't have your email, but this.
I have it.
Kim, you do? Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Cool. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you for
Have a
putting
good
this
evening.
on.
Good night.
Bye.
Do you want to stop the Facebook Live?
Yep.